We'll go ahead and get started here now that we are kind of getting a critical mass. Welcome to our webinar today with our cantor, Chad Fothergill. His reputation precedes him. He is a wonderful organist, lecturer, writer, teacher, and of course the cantor at Lutheran Summer Music. So we're just so thrilled that he's agreed to have a chat with us today about a lot of really important topics and a very timely one as well, as we are celebrating the Reformation here this week. So I just wanted to do a couple of nuts and bolts here before we get started. If you have questions, that's great. I would encourage you to use the Q&A function. So if you hover over your Zoom screen, you'll see a little Q&A button underneath. So you can type in the question, and once we are kind of wrapping up is when I think Chad is going to address some of those questions if you have them. So feel free to do that. If you are watching us on Facebook, we'll also keep an eye on the comments on the Facebook stream. So if you have questions, we'll make sure to get them into here as well so that Chad can answer those. We also want to make sure to thank the many supporters that make this webinar series possible, especially Robin High, who has sponsored this program. So without further ado, I think we should let Chad go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and highlight your video and you can take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Christina, and welcome everyone, whether you're watching now or later. For those of you who are interested in hymn trivia or hymnody, I'm actually talking to you from my home office here in Birmingham, Alabama, and it's actually located on Shades Mountain, which you might recognize as the name of a hymn tune. It's with There in God's Garden and Evangelical Lutheran Worship, and a text called Splendor and Honor in Lutheran Service Book. So just a little bit of trivia that I'm actually talking to you today from a hymn tune, which is actually quite a splendid garden. There's about 100 yards in front of me, there's a nature preserve that's really beautiful at all times of year. So in a few moments, I will switch out and do some slides as I talk a little bit. But just before we get started, kind of a roadmap of where we're going today. Obviously, we're in a very both difficult and interesting time. We're all sort of trying to figure out what's going on, both in our contexts, in the world, related to the pandemic, and a lot of what's happening and a lot of what's going to happen in the future once this kind of is resolved, or once there's a vaccine and things sort of return to a more customary routine. There are going to be some implications in the future, I think, for how we think about what we do, what we do in our own context and how we approach that. So what I'll do today is kind of take a look at some things related to pandemic, and then talk a little bit about singing as well. And then the last part really focus on teaching. I'll explain a little bit why those three things are important. Along the way, I'll try to suggest some practical things. So this is kind of a mixture of both reflective thinking through things, processing a little bit, but hopefully you can find some specific techniques to use in your context. I've kind of tried to chart a middle course here, so sometimes there'll be really like music theory heavy stuff in terms of talking about music. Other times the conversation will be a little bit more theological, so hopefully whether you're a musician, pastor, or if you serve on a worship committee, all of those things will be useful. So, I'll say more in a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and start some slides so that you can kind of follow along here. There we go. So a little bit about pandemic singing and teaching, kind of a reflection for, since yesterday was Reformation Sunday, this coming Saturday is actually Reformation Day. that's kind of where we are. And we start with sort of two timely questions. Where are we? And then the classic sort of Lutheran question, what does this mean? And again, sort of just pausing to reflect a little bit about where we are and what's going on. Obviously, we're in a great time of sort of sustained interruption, and our thoughts are going in many directions. We're trying to adapt. We're trying to find balance, trying to survive, kind of both in a figurative and literal sense of the term. For a lot of pastors and musicians, our vocations are shaped by work with an assembly and sort of the sensory input that comes with that, the sound of the voice, the smell and taste of bread and wine, or touch from the sharing of peace. And in the absence of that, you know, I think a lot of us are grieving, and we're also on the verge of potentially a very difficult winter when it comes to the virus itself. And, you know, we're sort of in the thick of it, and it's hard to process everything that's happening while you're experiencing it. And so we sort of cycle and move through stages of grief. Sometimes we might be in denial, sometimes in shock, sometimes we might be angry. And just like how grief affects those who are dealing with loss or another trauma, we cycle through them. Some days are better than others. We sort of yearn for stability and things to cling to, but the solutions always seem to remain elusive as our contexts change. So a lot has changed quickly, and, you know, just to point out, we can be forgiven, I think, for feeling tired or not having all the answers, or even sort of experiencing a whiplash in all of this. That's okay. Hopefully we all understand that, but it's also okay to take time and just for ourselves to recover and process a little bit. But it's, you know, this pandemic has also unfolded in a time when we're also going through other changes, sort of technological, cultural, that sort of affect the nature of our vocation. So the pandemic has, in a sense, even though we have all these things, it's sort of given us an opportunity to reflect a little bit, to plan for the future. You know, we have this moment of silence, sort of our sanctuaries are perhaps mostly silent. I know some people are reopening cautiously, but many sanctuaries are still silent. So we have an opportunity actually in that silence to maybe listen a little bit more carefully to our assemblies, to learn a little bit more about them, the places where we gather, the communities we serve, and even about our own vocations. And as we think about the future, I think it's also important to remember that normalcy is really only a temporary term. We like to speak a lot about returning to normal, but I think that presumes a lot. We won't be able to forget the memories of this or erase any of the sort of difficulty or trauma. We can't wave a wand and pretend like nothing ever happened. I know some of you may be experiencing economic hardship at your church related to budgets, maybe staffing. So there's a lot of change, and normal is something that's sort of elusive. And we can't either unsee the sort of inequalities that the pandemic has brought into relief around us about access to healthcare, its affordability, sort of insurance coverage and things like that. And pandemic has exposed and exacerbated a lot of things. So I won't use the phrase return to normal because that's kind of a tricky concept and a slippery slope. But I think we can still anticipate what's possible. We speak of what we do as a calling, and we are always sort of called into service, into the future, into hope. And so hopefully in what you hear today, you'll find something useful for your context, maybe a quote, an idea, an encouragement. Maybe there'll be something challenging that you want to think about a little bit more. you know, sort of just a disclaimer that, you know, I'm speaking from my experience, which comes from some full-time and part-time and supply posts in the upper Midwest. I lived in Philadelphia for about 6 years. Now I'm here in the South. So I don't know you or the places you serve. So you sort of have to maybe hear a lot of this and adapt it as you see fit to wherever you are. Kind of have to do the work of translation. And just one more thing to mention before we kind of dive in a little further to these, you know, pandemic singing and teaching topics. A few times I'll reference some hymns that, and I've tried to find examples that are in some of our common worship resources. And this is something we strive to do in our worship planning at Lutheran Summer Music. We look for hymns, songs that are familiar to a broad audience, both Lutheran and non-Lutheran. So if you see some of those hymnal abbreviations, CW, ELW, LBW, LSB, that's what some of those resources are from. And you can see our church music elective students from 2018 proudly holding some of their resources there. We play a hymnal scavenger hunt. That's kind of fun game during the early part of the course. So, starting with the pandemic. I want to start here because there are some specific historical connections, both for today, October 26th, as well as pandemic in general related to the church. The church maintains a calendar of sort of saints and figures, what we call a calendar of festivals and commemorations, that sort of highlight the witness of various people throughout history. Medieval times, before that, we commemorate the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we also commemorate people closer to our own time. Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations in the 20th century, has a feast day as well, or a commemoration date. But today is the actual commemoration of 3 Lutheran hymn writers. Their names are PHILIPP NICOLAI, JOHANN HEERMANN, and Paul GERHARDT. And it's important to mention them today because they all lived and wrote their hymns through times of immense hardship. They lived through the 30 Years' War. They all suffered the effects of plague and pestilence in their own time. But even with all that, they still wrote these wonderful hymns that sort of provide comfort. So I wanted to kind of just mention a few of those briefly. NICOLAI was a pastor, and less than a year into one of his pastorates, a plague struck where he was serving. And at its peak, about 30 parishioners, 30, died every single day. Probably during a 6-month period, there were about 1,000 members of his local parish that died because of plague. And the parsonage where he lived actually overlooked the graveyard or cemetery. And he was constantly officiating at funerals, and by virtue of where he lived was always reminded of death. But yet, during this time, he wrote some of his most enduring chorales. The Lutheran Church tends to call the 2 on your screen here, Wake, Awake, for Night is Flying, and O Morning Star, How Fair and Bright, which is sometimes translated as How Lovely Shines the Morning Star. Lutheran Church often calls these the king and queen of chorales. As the story goes, he wrote the second one, O Morning Star, just in a few hours. All the stanzas that we still don't sing today. If you know them or want to look at them later, they are just lovely texts. They're reassuring, they give hope. And so we sort of think of NICOLAI, especially on his commemoration today, because we too, as pastors and musicians, persist in our efforts, not always knowing when they provide someone else sort of a moment of solace or comfort or grace. So it's just a little bit of encouragement to keep on going and doing what we can do, even though we're not always aware of what significance that might have for someone. The second hymn writer is Johann HEERMANN, who lived a little bit after NICOLAI. HEERMANN was often sick as a child, and then went on during adulthood. He often suffered poor health. In fact, there was a period of about 4 or 5 years where he had some sort of throat condition. We think now perhaps a sort of esophageal or throat cancer that prevented him from speaking. And so he had to still write sermons, but someone else would preach them. But he also wrote a number of hymns. Places where he served suffered both plague and in some cases fire. There was one time where, you know, the place where he was serving was Lutheran, but there was sort of some conflict between different confessions, so Lutheran and Catholic, or princes or rulers who adhered to different confessions, which led to lots of war. And there's a story about him trying to escape his town by boat, and he could hear, you know, bullets whizzing past his head. So he lived a very sort of challenging life. But yet we have texts like, "O God, my faithful God," which have stanzas like this one shown here. "When dangers gather round, O keep me calm and fearless. Help me to bear the cross when life seems dark and cheerless. Help me, as you have taught, to love both great and small, and by your Spirit's might to live at peace with all." So some just really wonderful texts. And then Paul Gerhardt too lived through a lot of the effects of the 30 Years' War, wrote dozens and dozens of hymns about faith, about confidence, about trust. Gerhardt also represents sort of a shift in hymn writing. So instead of hymn stanzas about doctrine, he would take the theological ideas of those doctrines and turn them more into personal feelings. And so there's some plain language with some emotional warmth and sort of a personal touch in the music of Gerhardt. And one of the ones that is really appropriate for our time and place, I think, is Evening and Morning, which the tune comes from the later 17th century. You might know it. "Evening and morning, sunset and dawning, wealth, peace, and gladness, comfort and sadness. These are your works, rich in glory divine. Times without number, awake or in slumber. Your eye observes us, from danger preserves us, causing your mercy upon us to shine." We sing that at LSM occasionally, and it really, the students love singing that, especially when we get to dance the rhythm a little bit. There's another stanza later on that also speaks to our time and place. "Ills that still grieve me soon are to leave me, though billows tower and winds gain power. After the storm, the fair sun shows its face." So we have a lot to learn from their texts. Because of their theological sturdiness and poetic beauty, we sing them a lot, both in our congregations. We sing them at LSM, alongside the whole treasury of music from the centuries before the Reformation and since then. And even before these hymnists, we have Martin Luther himself writing about a time of plague. In 1527, clergy from a neighboring town asked him basically a question: should the faithful flee from the town and from work? Should they stop working because of the plague? Luther ended up writing his response during a plague outbreak where he was. So they had asked this question in the spring and later in the summer and fall. Luther ended up writing his response amidst a plague in Wittenberg. And it was sort of a very practical treatise that he ended up reading that really focused on care for the neighbor. That was the big theme in what Luther had to write. And I know that this has made the rounds in various worship resources and other forums, but there are a few passages that sort of always bear repeating from Luther's treatise about plague. You know, we do well to not take it lightly. We must take it seriously. So he sort of does criticize people who have a lighthearted approach to you know, our behavior during this time. So I know a lot of us in the church are really taking a lot of time to consider very, very carefully what this means for our assemblies and protecting the most vulnerable from us. And Luther, his words give us encouragement to do that. You know, he also describes that, as you can see here, God has created medicines and provided us with intelligence to guard and take good care of the body so that we can live in good health. If we don't do that, we run the risk of actually harming our neighbor. So he makes some notes about that. And then he also speaks a lot about fumigating. You know, at the time, people believed that the plague came from bad air, so that there was just something in the air, and didn't really have the full understanding that we have about sort of the droplets and aerosols that a lot of us talk about. But, you know, he says, I avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to be contaminated and not pollute or, you know, not infect others or cause their death because of my own negligence. So we do have encouragement from Luther about some of the safeguards and precautions that we're taking at this time. But the larger point about all of this is, you know, the church has survived pandemics before and has survived tribulations that frankly lasted much longer than what we're experiencing. These days, we sort of have a radically different notion of time. We have very carefully measured segments, usually by the hour, you know, according to television schedules and things like that. And our daily lives can really continue uninterrupted once the sun sinks below the horizon. The rate and speed at which information come to us, things move very quickly. And so to sit and pause and wait really does feel like an eternity for some of us. But Luther and these other hymn writers give us a lot to ponder. What Gordon Lathrop, the theologian, recently called related to scripture, he said, words for our waiting, which is a phrase that I really like. And in addition to hymns, we have the full gamut of psalms and all the emotions that the psalmists experience, just a catalog of very personal responses to difficult situations, both for the person and the community. Sort of our musical forebears remind us that death does not have the last word, that the song began before us, it will continue after us. We might grieve our situation, but yet we have hope and confidence. You know, times like this are why we do what we do and why we must do it well. And I always think too of this wonderful quotation by Mark Bangert, you know, that the church musician helps the assembly repeat week after week what will be true and helpful for a lifetime. So we do our work in order to prepare people. So thinking of what may come in the future, that's why we do our work. Yes, it's for the present, but also we anticipate things that will come. So that's a little bit just acknowledging this particular commemoration for these three hymn writers, thinking about lessons that they teach us for our time and place, especially in a pandemic. That's a little bit about that. Maybe gives you some things to think about. I want to move next and kind of briefly discuss the importance of singing. Sort of the Reformation festivals that we're in the midst of, Reformation Sunday yesterday and Reformation Day coming up on Saturday, are really important because of Luther's views on music. He actually had a theology of music that is sort of unpacked in a lot of his writings throughout his life, that music is a vehicle for praise, proclamation, prayer. And it's also an important component of teaching, which I'll get to in a little bit. If you really want to unpack Luther's full theology of music, you need about, I don't know, 24 books in a couple of semesters to get through that. So we won't go into that so much, but just to note that, yes, the pandemic has silenced some of our singing, but not our creativity or our sense of how we attend to a theology of music, even though sort of the main tools that we use are sort of on mute or quieter, muted. We're still trying to figure it all out, but it does not diminish the work to which pastors, musicians, and the church is called. It'll be interesting to see how musicians and congregations sort of utilize the maybe instrumental settings of hymns and carols, sounding the melodies and their sort of imaginative treatments and compositions, while parishioners maybe meditate on texts or, you know, watch from their from home in their pajamas or something. But even before all of the pandemic, there were some things in play that sort of challenged our very notions about singing and communal music making. And again, I want to sort of suggest that the pandemic offers an opportunity to think about some of those things and respond to them, sort of like while we're in this interim time. So these days, there are a few principles that we want to think about carefully with respect to what we do, and sometimes they conflict a little bit with cultural attitudes about music. So first of all, the primary musical instrument is the assembly's voice. That's the primary instrument. It's not the organ, not the piano, not the band. It's the voice of the people, whether they are singing and even when they are speaking. So responses in worship like, thanks be to God. That has a rhythm, there are accents, there are phrases. We attend to the whole nature of that voice. The other thing to keep in mind that's a little sort of countercultural, music is an activity. It's something to be made, something to be done, but not necessarily consumed, okay? And then the last one, I'll say more about this in a minute. Music needs to be adaptable to its time, place, and circumstances. That's sort of hard for us to conceptualize these days basically because of 19th and 20th century developments. Long after the Reformation, so getting more into the 19th century, music became something, we get the term art music. So songs, symphonies, string quartets, all sorts of things that became more and more for public enjoyment and entertainment. And the business of the composer became more about not just writing music for certain occasions, like if you were a court musician or a church musician writing, you know, like Bach, I have to write a cantata for this Sunday, I have to write a cantata for next Sunday. Oh no, what should I do this Sunday? Well, I'll revise the cantata I wrote 2 years ago and change some stuff. But I mean, these aren't clear-cut distinctions, but more and more in the 19th century, music became about the composition of masterworks, and masterworks for posterity, that they would outlive the composers. And these pieces became to be performed more and more by virtuosos and sort of celebrity musicians. You think of Franz Liszt and his piano recitals with adoring fans. And all of this sort of got solidified in the 20th century by having markets for publishers. All of a sudden we're selling recordings. And by the time we got to the late 20th century, it wasn't enough just to have a recording of, say, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You want to have the specific version that you like. You know, I want the Berlin Philharmonic. I want the Vienna Philharmonic. I want so-and-so conductor's tempi. Or I want, you know, I want Beethoven's Fifth played on period instruments or historical instruments, not modern instruments. And so music has, by and large, in our time and place, become sort of a consumer product. We have playlists of things we like. We can sort of insulate ourselves in the things that we like or that give us enjoyment. And so when people come to church to sing, sometimes those attitudes come with. And so we as church musicians sort of have to be mindful about how those attitudes kind of come into the church building and then affect the way that people are asked to sing. You know, I know that sort of sounds like a litany of complaints, but I think, you know, we can react to some of these observations in more constructive terms and use the pandemic, perhaps, as an opportunity to maybe let go of some of those commercial and market forces and recover some of those essential Reformation era beliefs about music and singing. You know, that it is important for teaching, that it is formative, that it's not just an entertainment. So just a few of these that are written about in other places, but just sort of a quick summary. One thing that's really important for me and that we talk about at Lutheran Summer Music in the church music class and with some of the organ students with hymns is that you want to lead so well as to become a necessary over time. Now that could happen during a given service. If you present solid leadership of a hymn that's sung in harmony, you can let go and let the assembly just take it from there. That happens many times at Lutheran Summer Music. We drop out and let the assembly just sing. But that also happens over time as songs are repeated or as sort of the melodies and words sort of seep into people's bones and sort of become of them, become part of them. You want to give over control to the people. We think of people who might be on their deathbeds, or we also think of, say, those dealing with memory loss or Alzheimer's patients. And we hear stories about how they can still remember songs from childhood, or say if someone is on their deathbed and they don't have the ability to see a new song, or they can't hold the hymnal. So we want to become unnecessary in a way so that people can take what we do in worship with them. We want to sort of lead and empower, instead of leading it or controlling the song, we want to sort of empower or nurture a sense of ownership of singing among the people. And sometimes that means even fostering a culture of singing outside worship. So, you know, think a little bit about other activities in your congregation. Do people sing a stanza of something at even a staff meeting, at a Bible study? When a group gathers for a meal, do they sing a doxology or some sort of table blessing? Singing doesn't have to only reside in worship, and it doesn't have to be only the job of the musician to do it. Same thing about the way we talk about musical choices. Instead of talking about favorites, you know, my favorite hymn, your favorite hymn, can we talk more about how those texts and, you know, change meaning over time or have changed meaning for us, how they're formative rather than just something to be enjoyed. And the last thing, which I'm going to get into next with regard to teaching, is sort of recover a sense of local responsibility as institutions change. Well, what does that mean? Basically, we're in a time where music and the arts are sort of declining in the sphere of both public education, be that, high school, say, but also in colleges and universities. More and more music departments or programs are experiencing some budget cuts. There's a school not far from me that last year stopped their organ program. We've seen this in seminaries as well. So as institutions change, sort of the church and its musicians might be called to kind of go back in and be the place where a lot of this training happens, which is what happened during the Reformation. It was a local, sort of a local focus and a local sort of responsibility to do all that. So that sort of gets me into some of the more practical things about teaching and the importance of teaching in the local setting. So, so much of what we have in the Reformation, the chorales, Luther's catechisms, the sermons, and things like that, all of that was written with a goal to teach. And the teaching was achieved through technology. In the 16th century, of course, that technology was the printing press, only about 50 to 75 years old by the time Luther arrived on the scene, ready to start talking about reform. Remember, he didn't want to split from the church, he just wanted to reform it. A lot of his success or ability to enact these reforms came from the ability to quickly disseminate ideas through print. There's this lovely book by Andrew Pettigrew, who's a historian, who even talks about how Luther understood this. And he would actually kind of, be in the printer's workshop. You can see him sort of hovering around and maybe interrupting from now and again. He'd make observations about the paper size, the page layout. He didn't want too big of a book because he didn't want to scare people. He even had things to say about the typefaces. And so with respect to music in the church, a lot of that stuff was the responsibility of the musician. The cantors of the parishes sort of wrote their own textbooks and developed their own curriculums that were important for their local places. Hymnals, for many decades, were local publications. So there was a hymnal for Wittenberg, there was a hymnal for Leipzig. All of the locales had their own hymnal. So cantors sort of attended to the body of song that worked best for a particular location. The idea of a larger hymnal for a full synod, for a full country, for a global church, that didn't come along until much later. So our teaching can kind of recover some of that focus, I think. Or if we think in those terms, sometimes it can be a little bit more helpful. Of course, today we have not print technology, but sort of this veritable explosion in digital technology, especially now with the pandemic and what we're learning about capabilities with Zoom and other forms of communication. This little list right here under the 21st century, those are things that a lot of musicians are doing that I've seen that are really exciting, that are fun and engaging. Some of them are in their living rooms at 7 o'clock every night leading a little hymn sing for a community. Some speak from their offices about a hymn that is important for the week, that relates well to where we are in the church year or the lectionary texts or something that the pastor wants to say in a sermon. Some go into the sanctuary, which is empty, but show themselves at their instrument, talking through decisions about the hymn of the day or the sermon hymn. Why was it chosen? What are some important features of it? And all of these things help to support and continue to nurture the sense of assembly song rather than just as an entertainment. The idea of teaching music rather than just dispensing it. sort of like an appliance, but there's an active sense of teaching and nurturing this idea of music. And even after, we hopefully have a vaccine and the immediate danger that we face now has passed, hopefully we can continue using Zoom, perhaps for planning, perhaps for coaching. We've done some of that at Lutheran Summer Music, where we've met with students and had coaching sessions, some lessons, some other things that we've tried over the summer. And I think especially of rural areas, I grew up in an area where the church was, a good 15 miles away, and another place that I played at was maybe 30, 35 miles away. And so I just think about, if I was serving in those locations now and might have students who were coming from similar distances, the ability to foster more connections, even though we are separated by distance, that we can still do things through the technology. We don't have to get rid of it once we can safely gather again. There are some other practical suggestions that I want to go through here. There are so many things that are possible, but I just kind of want to zero in on 4 of them here that are useful, again, for this teaching in a local context, to sort of recover a sense of ownership of the singing, to account for changes in our culture related to the way institutions support music and the way people are talking about or viewing music. So the 4 that I want to kind of breeze through here. First, the idea of the hymnal as a teaching tool. Second, that we can use the hymnal itself and its music as sort of a seed from which to generate all sorts of teaching material, especially vocal exercises for children's choirs, youth choirs, even adult choirs. Psalmody, the Psalms, the sort of what again Paul Westermeyer calls the womb of church music. So much of what we do comes from the Psalms, and so there's a lot that we can do about teaching Psalms, and using the Psalms as a means of teaching musical fundamentals, and then utilizing instruments in your congregation. So those are the 4, and so I just kind of want to run through these. Here's where it might get theoretical a couple times. So those of you who are music theory fans, this is your time to enjoy the engravings and stuff. Hymnals are useful for a lot of things, and if you've got, say, students who are more advanced and looking at aspects of music theory or composition, you can use a lot of songs in the hymnal to teach things like key signatures, time signatures. You can ask questions about things that are sung in the assembly. What is the meter? What scale was that? Was that a major scale? Was it a minor scale? Was it some odd combination of something? Was it a mode? We still use old Renaissance modes for some of the things that we sing. And the fact that the hymnal is not just something that needs to live in a pew and be kept clean and pristine. Hymnals are meant to be open. They're meant to show their wear and tear. One of my favorite things is seeing a hymnal that is sort of creased and bent, and maybe even the pages are sort of rough because there's been a sprinkling of water during a remembrance of baptism while that page is open. And so now the water got on the page, it dried, and so the pages are just kind of crinkly and rough. It's one of my favorite things to see in a church. But just the notion that the book itself, to provide access to it, is so important. So for confirmation, I know there's a practice of presenting Bibles to students, but we can also give them hymnals. At the start of academic years, instead of, there are some rituals of blessing teachers, of installing teachers, and some places bless bicycles and backpacks, but we can also bless hymnals too. We can provide students with hymnals, bless them. We can talk to our congregations and young people about the anatomy of a hymnal, where to find certain information, where to find prayers. It's much more useful than just, open to hymn 1, 2, 3, and now sing. There's much more in a hymnal just besides the hymns. And especially these days, for people who might not have access to hymnals at home, now is a time where the church could be lending hymnals or helping support the purchase of hymnals for people who might not be able to afford a hymnal, or order in bulk from a publisher and then let people pay whatever they want to help support that. So there's a lot of things that can actually happen from the physical book itself. One of my another favorite quote of mine is from Basil the Great, who lived in the 4th century, just showing how important these things are. He talks about people who rarely leave the church, easily retaining in memory some maxim of either the apostles or the prophets, but they do sing the texts of the Psalms at home and circulate them in the marketplace. So even Basil in the 4th century is telling us to, that the music can live outside of the church and be part of the wider community. Tunes are for teaching. There's a lot of things you can do with a hymn tune to help a young musician sort of understand fundamentals, or to teach basic things about music, both to young singers, to young instrumentalists, and even people who just kind of want a refresher about some of those things. So you can use hymns to teach scales, or scale types, major, minor, articulations, about breathing and phrasing and choir rehearsal, dynamics, things like staccato and legato. And I just want to share some kind of 4 quick examples of what you might be able to do. Here's a hymn tune. I think that's in all 4 of the hymnals I mentioned earlier, where it's a very, very scalar tune. We get all the notes of the major scale. Do, re, mi, fa, so, do, ti, la, so, mi, re, do. So you get the full scale, and then you get this big old leap of a 6th right here. And so you can repeat that at different intervals and just show how the scale works, maybe even use it as sort of a warm-up. Another tune, Lobe den Herrn, praise to the Lord the Almighty. You could turn this into a warm-up technique for, say, a youth choir, and maybe write this out on a dry erase board or a chalkboard in your rehearsal room, and show and change parts of it for different rehearsals. So introduce staccato marks or marcato and legato, and talk about what those mean, and practice singing them either with the text, praise to the Lord, well, you'd have to go on, Almighty, the King of creation, or with solfege, do, do, so, mi, re, do. You could add dynamics and say, okay, sing the first part forte or loud, strong, sing the second part piano, soft, do, do, so, mi, re, do, things like that. Do, do, so, mi, re, do, do, so, mi, re, do, and sort of incorporate it into warm-ups. Tunes like For All the Saints kind of do the opposite in terms of direction. Instead of the ascending 5th of Lobe den Herrn, do, 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 we have the reverse here, so, mi, re, do. And here's one where you could talk about breath or dynamics or shaping a phrase. So, mi, re, do. Or you could play a little game, like make the first note a fermata, and tell singers to experiment with kind of a gradual crescendo and diminuendo. So, mi, re, do. Things like that. And then, try it at different intervals. And then there are tunes like Bunasan, where that goes through this long arpeggio at the beginning. I sigh to sing, ya da da dee 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 dee, which works really well for a warm-up, for pitch accuracy, for breath. So we can develop a lot of really interesting material for our choirs, for just warm-ups, or if there's a new hymn that we're going to sing in worship, looking at some of its major sort of rhythmic, melodic characteristics, and developing warm-ups based on that, so that all of a sudden those intervals are familiar to our singers. Psalms are an opportunity to involve musicians of all ages. There are psalm versifications that work well for drones or orff instruments, so you can get young children to play parts on, say, and any versification of a psalm that's in a hymnal, so putting it in its more metrical form. Children and youth choirs, if it's too much to sing an anthem every month, sing a psalm refrain every month or twice a month. Learn little things and do them more often, so that they understand that they're not just an occasional entertainment, but sort of a vital and an important part of worship. You can also sort of give children either chimes or bells, and they can ring them between the chanting of psalm verses. So you get sort of a clang, and then to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul, ding, so they can help the congregation sort of punctuate the psalm phrases that way. And then instrumentalists. Here's the part that I think we often overlook, because we wait for the publishers to give us things, but some of us work with two bassoonists, a clarinet, and a French horn player, between all of them between the ages of 10 and 80 at various different skill levels. And so we often have to adapt we can use our hymns to create material from them, whether that's making parts for the melody, even just playing an inner part, an alto or a tenor voice, up or down an octave, can kind of create an instant descant. We've done that at Lutheran Summer Music as well for morning prayer. And we can also take published chorale preludes that might have the melody in, say, the right hand for a piano part, or say the feet for an organist, and just give those to the instrumentalists and have them play instead of the organist or keyboardist. So we can take the materials that we're given and adapt them. I will go very briefly through this part. We just have to remember too that there are transposing instruments. So let's say we're working with a clarinetist who plays a B-flat clarinet. They'll see this pitch C, but when they play it, it actually sounds a B-flat below that. So in order to compensate, we have to kind of go in the equal and opposite direction. So instead of down a whole step, we have to show them up a whole step, so that when they actually play the D, it sounds the C that we want. So for instance, if someone were to read, the clarinetist were to read Holy, 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 if they were to play it right from the hymnal, we'd get that middle one with sort of these clusters of notes. So for the clarinetist, we actually have to transpose up so that what they see and play matches what the assembly is singing. There are all sorts of resources online that even I think some of the basic Wikipedia articles about instruments that show their usual ranges, what notes are impossible, what works for beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels. All sorts of things out there to do with instruments, which is, again, something we do a lot at Lutheran Summer Music. We're always making instrumental parts for the people who want to play or have expressed interest. Even for people who don't think that they are musicians, which usually everyone's a musician. But, again, our culture tells us that there are celebrity musicians, and there are not, but most people exist on a continuum. People can help with different library assignments, helping keep track of the music library, cleaning bells. Young piano students, it's kind of fun maybe if they want to help tune the organ sometimes, to have them hold notes, and they can kind of hear different tunings and things like that. And also, involving young adults as members of worship and music communities. That was one really interesting thing that happens at Lutheran Summer Music. We ask the members of the church music class to help plan and lead an evening prayer service, and they love that. We don't need to kind of guess what young people are interested in. we can always just ask them and put a seat at the table for them. And finally, just so those are 4 very quick things that you could do in your parish, again, to kind of recover this notion of teaching. There are some wonderful resources out there that help focus on these things. There's a wonderful set of essays in memory of Ronald Nelson, who composed some of the liturgical music that are familiar to many of our congregations. This wonderful collection of essays about children, choirs, and music. Carl Schulk has written a couple volumes of reflections about children in liturgy and worship that are available from Morningstar Music Publishers. And then journals such as Cross Accent from the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians. There are lots of wonderful articles in our synodical, denominational, and other professional resources. And if you happen to have your back issues, the spring 2014 issue was all about children, music, and worship, with even some reflections about Lutheran summer music. So finally, you know, that was kind of a whirlwind of things, but just to kind of close, we have that sort of question of now what, or so what? I think the pandemic time invites us to really consider what is convenient versus essential about our work, about what we do. You know, we hear that we heard that term a lot early on, the essential worker. But there's a lot to unpack there about what we need. The pandemic has asked us to sort of rethink a lot of what we assume or think about in terms of our abundance and the amenities that we take for granted, to think more carefully and intentionally about what we do in the nature of our work. And so the big point is that before us, there's a lot to reflect on. There's an invitation to do a lot of really faithful work. And hopefully we are open to the blessings, challenges, and lessons that follow. So I'm going to stop there. I did not leave a lot of time for questions, but my email address is there at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to send a follow-up, but we can also entertain a few questions if there are any. So Christina, come back and take it away if you want.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Can you see me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Well, that was just incredibly powerful and encouraging to kind of put all of that into context. You know, we are not the first people to go through this, even though we often hear that word unprecedented. So it's just nice to know that, you know, great art and great worship has been experienced in this way several times before. While we kind of give people a minute to, you know, think about whether they have questions or things like that, I just wanted to point out a lot of these things that Chad was talking about, the creative use of instruments in worship, the creative warm-ups used. It makes me think of you rehearsing the chapel choir in that rehearsal room. Are those things that are those warm-ups and exercises things that you have done with Lutheran summer music students before?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at my notes to see which hymns they actually were. I mean, for now, I was just looking at sort of some common examples and as many resources as possible. But we've done that. We've introduced a new psalm tone as a warm-up and things like that. So when it comes time to actually rehearse it, we can focus more on text rather than just learning notes.
Right. Yeah, of course. And when you were talking about kind of these interludes where you might ring bells or you might have other types of chimes and sounds, I just think about the thunder tubes in the chapel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just what a delight it is for all the students, even the ones who aren't singers or things like that. So just for the reference of everybody tuning in, I see we have some of our students who have logged in. We have a lot of church musicians here with us today, alumni. I just want to make clear that we are planning for a full and robust summer program. We're planning for the best case scenario or the normal case scenario, as the case may be. But based on everything that Chad has been telling us, I'm feeling very confident that if we do need to make adjustments, we'll be able to do that in a really fulfilling way. So if you yourself are an age to attend LSM or know a young musician who might be interested, I know that we will have a lot to learn no matter what next summer looks like. So do I see that we have a question here in the Q&A?
Yeah, I think so. Are you able to read it for us?
Yes. So our question is from John, and he asks us, while there is a particular value to pausing for reflection, what are the places in the embrace of the new right now that give you hope for what will join our methods and tools going forward?
Yes, I really think, you know, speaking in terms of Lutheran summer music, at least the chance to remain connected with students via like a Zoom interface, or to have a periodic master class now and then, or you know, I think the Zoom technology is really useful for that continuation of teaching. I think a lot of places are also recovering rituals in the home. So I know that, you know, when the pandemic first became really severe for a lot of people right around Holy Week and Easter, that people were doing foot washing for Maundy Thursday in the home, singing around the home, or maybe in Advent, people are talking about, you know, singing around an Advent wreath, things like that. So I hope the new involves a few things. I hope it continues to involve technology. I think it invites us to reconsider our notion of what a community is. That communities don't have to be just tied to the building. That's a common saying that I think we in the church have heard a lot of. You know, the church has left the building, and that's okay. It will come back to the building, but it can also exist outside of it. So kind of holding all those things in balance. I think there are a lot of people who've been spurred to compose or arrange more, to figure out what to do in their local context or for who's available. I think there's been a lot of interesting instrumental music that's being written because, you know, we're a little nervous about singing, and that we can create these offerings in our settings that be used for devotional purposes, you know, other sorts of reflections that we can do. So I think really it's just up to our imaginations and holding a lot of these things in balance. I'll have to think about that a little bit more, about what I'm most excited about, because I think I'll have to be less tired to get fully excited.
Well, no, I think that's a great answer. Thank you, John, for asking that question. And since we are kind of talking about resources and things that you might be able to use in your own congregation, I do want to just share with everybody via our chat here that we have created a resource page through Lutheran Summer Music, which was much of the work done by Chad to put this together. So there's things like a virtual evening prayer service. So if you would like to put on an evening prayer service, perhaps during Advent, there are instrumental parts, vocal parts, bulletins to follow along. And it's just a compilation of music from our past few summers together. So that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do, you know, from your home or in small groups as well. I also wanted to point out that if you are thinking about putting together a digital offering for Christmas or for an upcoming performance, we do have another webinar on November 9th. If any of you saw Chad conducting our virtual choir of Luther's Morning Prayer a few months ago, the same audio video engineer who put that together will be teaching this webinar on November 9th. So that's a great opportunity to learn more about doing that, you know, digital, virtual, so to say, performance style. So if we don't have any more specific questions here, I will be sending a follow-up email to all of our attendees tomorrow. And so I'll include your information, Chad, there, and your email address if you're okay with that, and share all those wonderful resources from your slides as well. And you can watch the video again, share it with a friend, keep calling upon this information. So is there anything you'd like to add in closing?
Nope.
Great.
No, well, thank you to everyone, not only for tuning in. I hope there was something useful in all that talking, but just thank you for your continued work and service and doing what you do in your places. Thank you. That's not a lot. We probably don't hear that enough. So know that it's appreciated by those of us who see what you do, you know, beyond your own community. And, you know, for those of you who are students at LSM who may have tuned in, we miss you and we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully very soon.
Well, thank you, Chad, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time. All right.
Bye-bye.